After 19 years of Mosse Lectures, we can actually organize these events because of the legacy left to us by George Mosse, the eminent historian of German Jewish origin, who taught gay and lesbian studies at the University of Amsterdam back in the late 1980s. Or, George Mosse shares with David, is the background of a Jew's history of persecution. David's mother had fled Eastern Europe in search of a safety the old continent could not provide, and the family was deeply marked by the Holocaust. Then there is the theme of the outsider that comes with being a homosexual, an outsiderness which David, other than Mosse I think, cultivated and celebrated and stylized, undoubtedly guided by the hippie culture of San Francisco, where he moved as a young adult. No better example of David's all-out celebration of outsiderness than his famous documentary, The Cockettes. This film portrays a hippie drag theater troupe in the late 1960s and early 70s. The Cockettes performed a kind of acid-driven sexual anarchy, a gender guerrilla, staging an explosion of glittering sexy wildness uncontainable by either the letter L or G or B or T or Q, uncontainable by the whole alphabet, I'd say. Mosse's courage to recall and discuss his being susceptible to Nazi aesthetics resonates well with the empathy David Weissman brings to his histories, most strikingly in the documentary We Were Here. This film is a powerful record of the testimonies of 5 San Franciscans who survived the carnage of the AIDS epidemic. David Weissman, an incredible filmmaker, activist, teacher, queer community elder, and beautiful man.
Let me start with the title of the talk. The talk is From Activist Filmmaker to Queer Community Elder. Originally there was a subtitle that got dropped somewhere along the line, which was An Unexpected Journey. Titles are inherently reductionist, so I'll elaborate a bit. The unexpected journey part refers to the fact that I've always been pretty inept at making life plans or having conventional goals. I didn't go to university, I never imagined myself becoming a filmmaker, certainly not a documentary filmmaker. The 2 queer historical documentaries I'm best known for, The Cockettes and We Were Here, both emerged from big bang moments of inspiration rather than from long deliberation. So my presence here today is significantly a result of serendipity, political and artistic passions, and many years of wondering about what am I going to be when I grow up. As for the queer community elder piece, this is something we sort of came up with on the phone. I guess to some degree using that word does mean that I have actually to some degree grown up. I use the word elder not so much as a reference to age, but in the more traditional sense of a community member whose life experience can be brought to bear in service of and in benefit of others. I recently revisited the original proposal that I wrote for my Conversations with Gay Elders project, and I came upon this paragraph. I've often felt like the AIDS epidemic made me a premature elder in my community. This is directly related to the deaths of so many men in the generation just above me, men who would have been my mentors and whose memory I've wanted to preserve. Further, my experience of the epidemic was very much colored by having Holocaust history in my own family and the awareness that gave me of the cathartic and long-lasting value of sharing painful and complex stories between generations. And thus I began to make historical documentaries. They both came out of moments where the idea came up in a conversation, and what I realized, this is kind of a disease of documentary filmmakers, is in that moment I thought, nobody's going to do this unless I do, and if someone else does, they'll do it wrong. So this is sort of what motivated both of the 2 movies, and I'll talk a little bit more particularly about how We Were Here came to pass. The movies are both about San Francisco, which in many ways is the city that has been my home for most of my life, and I consider both films, though they're very different in tone, to be love letters to San Francisco. So the kind of extraordinary, fertile environment it created for all kinds of rebels going back many decades, really going back to the gold rush in the 1850s. San Francisco was a place where rebels and people who wanted to get away from whatever was stifling them in their real life came to the West Coast for adventure, and San Francisco was really the place where that quest for freedom manifested more than anywhere else in the United States. My point of departure for today's talk is a project I began in 2014, which is the Conversations with Gay Elders project. I'll speak a bit more about the project's inception and the intention behind it, and then I will explore aspects of my personal and family history and the political and cultural context of my life that shaped the unexpected journey that led to this project. The idea with this project was to capture the stories of gay men who realized they were different long before the modern gay liberation movement offered a public context for positive self-image. These pre-Stonewall experiences are qualitatively different from those experiences of any of us whose coming out came after gay liberation. And capturing these stories is obviously time sensitive. So to start, I'm going to show a 7-minute compilation of just the beginning segments of 6 completed pieces. Each of the pieces is about, they range from 55 to 75 minutes in length. They each just focus on one person. I'm an on-screen participant in all of them except for the very first one that I shot because being on screen hadn't occurred to me yet. And each of these was edited. Actually, there's 6 pieces, and there have been 5 editors working on these, all of whom are gay men in their 20s and 30s. The idea was that the project would be a cross-generational collaboration, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. The stylistic differences of the pieces reflects the input and choices of the editors, who were given a lot of leeway in doing their work.
Let's just look at each other for a second. So, young man, what's your name?
Kirby Lauderdale.
Wow, and how old are you, Kirby?
I'm 77.
Which means you were born in?
1938.
Wow.
Today we'll hear how some couples cope with the devastating news that their spouse was gay. Kirby and Linda, you are now divorced.
That's correct.
But you were married for 18 years. Right. What did the counselor say?
Have a good marriage, have a good sex life, and it'll go away.
So I am rolling.
A camera slate.
You okay?
Yep, good.
B mark.
Ow!
Sunset Boulevard, it's take 13. A cam, Mark. B cam.
Madame, the cameras are rolling.
I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. Director.
Got all emotional watching that. I just got that together about a week ago, and it was so lovely to see all of those guys together, and I sent it to all of the young editors, and they were also really just delighted to see the cumulative efforts that they put into this all kind of pieced together. Unlike the other projects that came up in these moments of kind of like, woo, this is the thing that I have to do now, this project had a longer gestation, and it also didn't have a specific end intention, which I'll also talk a little bit more about later. But there was one specific moment that that was catalytic for this particular piece. I'm involved with a kind of a very, very undefinable gay subculture called the Radical Fairies. And because it's undefinable, I won't try too hard to define it, but basically it's an international movement now. It started in the late 70s. And it's evolved through a million different forms, and it's grown and grown. But basically, it serves as a kind of a alternative environment for gay men and trans men also to spend time together outside of the conventions of what gay culture normally offers in the urban environments. And some people come to it for spiritual reasons, some people come to it for community. I mean, I think everybody comes to it for community. But I think everybody comes to the Radical Fairies on some level to try to find a deeper and more honest way of being both with themselves and being with other gay men. And I found it to be an incredibly rich community. There's gatherings that happen in France. There used to be a Radical Fairy gathering that happens. Does anyone know if the Netherlands gathering still happens? It still does. And it's become this kind of just like huge gay subculture for people who are looking for something richer in terms of their identity. So I was at not exactly a fairy gathering, but similar to a fairy gathering. This was in 2013. And as I am often oriented to do, I sit next to the older guys because I'm often interested in hearing what kind of stories they have. And I was sitting next to this man who was 84 years old at the time, and he was telling me about having sex in a bombed-out castle in Frankfurt in 1946. And I'm thinking, you know, there aren't many people in the world who can tell a story like that, given his age, and also that he was sexually active in the military in occupied Germany. And I'm completely fascinated by his story, and as I'm sitting there, I'm thinking that there's this whole group of other men at the gathering who I knew very well, a whole group of young men, who were hanging out primarily with themselves, as younger people often think that they're the most interesting people at an event like that, which is fine. But in my mind, I'm thinking I wanted to go and shake them and say, hey, don't you realize that this is an opportunity that you may never have again, which is to hear someone of a completely different generation tell a story that's inconceivable to you. And fortunately, I restrained myself from going and wagging my finger in their face, and partially that's because of my own experience in my own family. As Matthijs indicated, my mother and her parents, my mother was born in Lodz in Poland in 1925, and when she was 2, the family moved. My mother, her brother, and their parents moved to Bucharest, and so they were living in Romania from 1927 until 1939. And they got out of Bucharest, and basically the entire rest of the family, which had been in Poland for, you know, many generations, was completely, like 100% wiped out. So my mother died when I was 15, and my grandparents were dead by the time I was 30. And I never asked them questions about any of that history, and I think partially it was just developmental, and I think partially historically as well, these things were not talked about. It was a subject matter that was so profoundly awful that I think that the people who were carrying around that history just didn't want to talk about it. But I realized that, you know, at 65, well, next week 65, at 65 I have questions that I didn't have at 64, let alone at 22 or 16. So in that situation at the gathering, I knew that it was normal that these younger men wouldn't have the instincts to go and sit next to an older man and say, hey, tell me your story. And so on some level, that moment was a catalyst for me of thinking that maybe I could be an intermediary. I have both the maturity and the historical knowledge to do interviews that younger people couldn't do. And that maybe by doing so, I could provide a kind of an archive of pre-Stonewall stories that would be available after this generation of men is no longer around. So that was a kind of a catalytic moment. Jack Lasner, who's in the Zumba class, he was the first interview that I did. And Jack is notorious at the gym for spending a lot of time in the steam room and the showers. So what he didn't say was that he may have been one of the major reasons that the steam room was closed. But I'm taking the liberty of telling you that now here in Holland. So before I get into the project itself, I'm going to jump back in time to a series of moments that I think had a big impact on the way I think about all of this stuff. In 1988, I believe it was, or 89, I was living in San Francisco. Just a little bit of biographical background. I spent my whole life in California except for a year in Amsterdam in the middle 80s. I was my whole life on the West Coast. I grew up in Los Angeles. I lived in San Francisco from 1976 until 2004, and then I moved to Portland, Oregon. So I was in San Francisco from the time before Harvey Milk was elected, through the assassination, and then through the onset and the bulk of the worst of the AIDS epidemic. So my history there is very rich and very full, and living there in the years of the epidemic was a pretty profound and life-altering experience. There was a psychologist named Leon McCusick who eventually died of AIDS. And Leon gave a talk that I went to, and it was called Multiple Loss Syndrome and Gay Men, or Gay Men and Multiple Loss Syndrome. And, you know, we didn't have the, average people, I was not a psychologist, weren't thinking about those things. We were in the kind of experience of terror and death and fear for our own health. It was a very scary time in San Francisco. And I think in many ways, the experience of the epidemic was more visible in San Francisco than anywhere else because of both the geographic tightness of the gay community there, but also because of the fact that everybody was out in San Francisco. Unlike in, even in New York, there was, huge numbers of gay people, but many of them were closeted, and so that also impacted the way the epidemic was perceived and experienced on the street. But Leon gave this talk, and it really struck me, the whole notion that there was a multiple loss syndrome and that we as a community were experiencing that. And at this point, there was no end in sight. And I was so knocked out by Leon's talk, and what started for me there was the realization that there were two kind of parallel histories that resonated for me as connecting with. One was Vietnam veterans who had come back from the Vietnam War completely unwelcomed because the war had been so unpopular, and they had lived through terrible, terrible traumas, both of whatever they participated in that they might have felt not so happy about, but also the terrible losses that they experienced in Vietnam. And then they come back, and no one wants to hear about it, no one wants to honor them or talk to them about it. So they were kind of a pariah community that was sort of trapped with these terrible memories and terrible traumas and nowhere to talk about it and nowhere to process it or to have it validated. The other experience, obviously, was my own family's experience, and I think the broader community that was dealing with Holocaust histories. As far as I can remember, we certainly learned about the Holocaust when I was a child. It was an absolutely central part of our education, but I don't recall anyone ever talking about their personal experiences, ever. And I do remember that in the early 80s that started to change, and people started opening up with their stories, and people who had questions started asking questions. So what I started to realize in listening to Leon's speech about multiple loss syndrome, and I don't know how conscious I was at the time, but in looking back I know that it was very catalytic in terms of the way I was experiencing my own journey through the epidemic, was the sense that if any of us survive this, which at that point we didn't know, there will be a point at which we will need to talk about it and at which people will have questions to ask. So that speech I really consider to be a really pivotal moment for me in terms of how I think about history, how I think about processing of trauma, and the intersections between my family history and what my community was going through in relationship to the epidemic. So let me jump forward again I moved to Portland in the early 2000s. And I was at a kind of an after party from, I think it was a Rufus Wainwright concert or something. And it was a little private party in a bar, and everybody was drinking cocktails. And it was pretty late at night. And I was, 52, 51 at the time. And I was talking to these two guys in their early 20s. And we're making chit chat. And then at a certain point, something came up that resulted in me saying that I had lived in San Francisco during all of the worst years of the epidemic. And in my mind, immediately, is end of conversation, nobody's going to want to talk about this or hear about this. And much to my surprise, both of them were like, whoa, what was that like? And it really stunned me because I had never experienced that before. And I didn't anticipate it. And we actually went outside from this bar we were all drinking, and they wanted to ask me stories. And it was an experience that I'd never had, partially because they were so young, and also just the context in which it came up. So that moment also had a big impact on me, and thinking, that was really unexpected. And in a sense, it was the first experience I had as a survivor of those years, of being put in the position of being asked by people who were not there, particularly young gay men. In the middle 2000s, I had a boyfriend who was much younger than me, who had also gone to film school. And in the year and a half or so that we were involved with each other, he heard me tell a lot of stories about my experiences living in San Francisco during the years of the epidemic. And at one point we were driving in the car, and I was telling him something about something or other having to do with those years. And he said, you know, my generation really has no visceral understanding of what that experience was like. We know that we're supposed to wear condoms. We know that something happened to you guys, but we don't really know. And he said, and it's been so kind of amazing hearing from you these personal stories of, you know, the traumas and the politics and everything around the epidemic. And he said, I don't know exactly how it came up, but I think he sort of said, somebody should make a movie about it, or he said, I should make a movie about it. And my immediate reaction was, it's the last thing in the world that I have any interest in doing, is making a movie about AIDS. Partially just because I didn't want to revisit it myself. Just the idea of going back there was so traumatic. But also because my motivation in making movies is to be inspirational and uplifting in some way. Not exclusively, but it has to be there. I've never wanted to make a movie that was a downer, and I thought, well, how do you make a movie about the AIDS epidemic that isn't going to leave people completely destroyed? But again, within about a minute, I realized that I did need to make that movie. Very similarly with the Cockettes, I had this feeling of nobody's going to do it if I don't, and if someone else does it, they're going to do it wrong. It felt very important to me, and again, this was very much a big bang moment for me. I realized that it needed to be told by someone who lived through it and not by a journalist. At least from my vantage point, it felt very important that that happened. And if I was going to do this, I really wanted to focus on San Francisco. So that was sort of the genesis of We Were Here. And in looking back on it, I realized it was the genesis in some way of this cross-generational historical storytelling life that I'm living, because David was 28 years younger than me at the time, and it was his question that led to me making this movie. I never would have made a movie about the AIDS epidemic without the impetus provided by this much younger man and his curiosity about the period. How do you approach an incredibly complex 30-year history that embodies politics and emotion and health and trauma? I mean, it's an enormous history, even confined to San Francisco. How does one make a movie like that without making a 20-hour miniseries? And I didn't really know how I was going to approach it, and I thought, well, I'll just start doing interviews. I will, and see what happens. I'll start gathering material. I thought maybe I'll do 50 interviews, and at some point I'll start to have a sense of how a story can be structured and what kind of a story it would be. And as I started mentioning to friends, particularly peers who had lived through that period, the reaction that I got was very intense that I was doing this, because what I don't think we consciously thought about in regard to the epidemic was that there was no VE day. There was no day that the epidemic ended and we could all celebrate and go out and have a drink together and commiserate about what we had lived through. Basically what happened is that the drugs started getting a little bit better and the death rate started slowing down. And so basically the emotional experience, and I'm speaking mostly from the vantage point of San Francisco, though I think it's parallel in other places, but mostly the experience was a kind of a winding down of the horror and a kind of an attempt to ease back into some sense of normalcy. In a way, the epidemic had become its own normalcy for us. I think in any crisis situation, you have to do that as a means of coping because you can't live in a constant sense of crisis. The epidemic sort of became the new normal. And so as the 90s started to move into 2000s, basically it stopped becoming the #1 main focus of everyone's lives. And slowly, moved on. And up until I started making We Were Here, there had been nothing really, as far as I know, even in books, that really took a historical look back at what we had gone through. And so in a sense, what I was doing the first, and I think other people were starting to work on similar things right around the same time. There's an interesting kind of zeitgeist mystery around so many of these things. But as I would tell people that I was doing this, the reaction was often like, ooh, I don't know if I could see a movie like that, or oh my God, I've got so many wounds that are just buried under a very thin scab. And there was very little sense of, oh, I'm really excited that you're doing this, I can't wait to see the movie. And so that was a kind of it was just a reality check. And in a sense, my sense with my objectives with the movie was that I wanted it to play once at the Castro Theater. If that happened, everything else would be gravy. But the idea was I really wanted to have that experience in the Castro Theater, which is an enormous, beautiful old movie palace right in the heart of the gay district in San Francisco that so many powerful events have happened at over the years. Fundraisers and gay film festivals and very moving events, premieres of important films, The Times of Harding Milk, other films. So it's this kind of temple of queer history and a temple of the community that built up over the decades in the Castro. So I really felt like I want to make a movie that will play at the Castro Theater once. I'm making this for my people. I'm not making it for anyone else. If other people see it and it works for them, that's great. So I had been at a screening of a wonderful film called Word Is Out, which was really the very first documentary made by gay people, about gay people, for gay people. It came out in the 70s. And there was a 30-year anniversary screening of it. And very quickly as it started to play, I thought, this is how I want to do We Were Here. It's very simple, very deep, in-depth interviews with people of all ages, gays and lesbians, some of whom had come out in the 70s and some of whom had been in the military in World War II. So it's kind of a survey of all different ages and races and types of gay stories, and there had never been anything like that before. But I also knew, Word Is Out had 26 people in it, and I knew that I did not want to do that in telling the story of the epidemic. I knew that I wanted to go, I think this is just my intuition, I wanted to go for depth rather than breadth, and hope that the depth would provide breadth on its own. And so, ultimately, none of this was planned on. By the way, I'm completely telling stories that I hadn't planned on telling. So there were two experiences in the making of We Were Here that also very much affected my way of thinking about these issues. One was around the issues of cross-generationality and storytelling. One was a fundraiser that was held at the home of one of the subjects of the film, of We Were Here. And it was mostly people of my generation, and it was mostly gay men. And in this conversation, we had a little discussion. I showed a little 5-minute clip of some of the early interviews that I had done. And in the discussion, it was very interesting that numerous people said, I never talk about my experiences. It's too painful. Nobody's going to want to hear this. I don't want to bring people down. And I also don't want to sound like I'm trapped living in the past. And I heard this from a number of people in that room, which I thought was fascinating because, again, it resonated with my sense of, the Holocaust history in my own family and the silence and the feeling that no one wants to hear these stories. Then about 2 weeks later, I showed the same clip to a wonderful group called Art Fag Potluck, which was exactly what it was. It was people it was like a monthly potluck of people who considered themselves art fags, which is anything you wanted to define it as. And they were basically these just get-togethers of whoever wanted to come, and people would bring food, and each one would have 2 designated artists who would do like 15-minute presentations of their work and then have a structured conversation. They were absolutely wonderful. And I was one of the designated presenters one time, and I showed this same little clip. And at this situation, it was almost all people under 30. There was about 15 men and women under 30 who were watching this. And that conversation was completely the opposite. They were completely fascinated by the material and the stories. And a number of them said, I want to know more about this. I've always wanted to know more about this, but I don't know if it's okay to ask. I don't know if it's going to bring people down, if it's going to bring up bad memories. One guy said, my housemate is, in his 50s, and I know he lived through that, and I just don't know if it would be painful for him for me to ask. So here you're getting the exact opposite thing. The older people think no one wants to hear about it, and the younger people are afraid to ask because they don't know if it's too painful. So again, the parallels with the Holocaust story. And so I realized that there is a huge gap to be bridged in terms of how our generations speak to each other, both in terms of the preservation and passing on of history, but just also in terms of what does it mean to be gay? What does it mean to have intergenerational connections? And one of the things, not only in these stories, but in people's biographies, one of the stories you hear from so many gay men is of mentoring stories that they've experienced in their youth when they were just coming out. And those stories can range from how do you avoid getting busted if the police raid a bar, to being taken to the opera and learning the sort of bourgeois arts of the kind of classic gay lifestyle. So it's been traditional, and I mean, I'm sure there are scholars who could speak better to this than me, but going back to Socrates and the notion of the elder as a guide and as a mentor to younger generations. So all of these aspects started to kind of ferment in my mind, probably some consciously, some unconsciously, but they all started to lead me forward into this increasing concern that there are big gaps in the ability of gay men to speak to each other across generations. Now I'm going to step back for a second and address a question that I know will come up in the Q&As. Why am I talking all about gay men here? And why is the Elders Project specifically men? And I don't feel qualified to work out of that realm. The kinds of interviews that I do are very emotional and very deep and very intimate. And in a sense, the success of those interviews, both in We Were Here, in relationship to the epidemic, and in the Gay Elders Project in relationship to the process of coming out and finding one's comfort in their sexual orientation, is based in a kind of a camaraderie and shared experience. So that's where I felt competent, and that's sort of why my focus in the project has specifically been gay men, and I'd be happy to answer and talk about that further in the Q&A if people have questions or thoughts about that. My thoughts about the younger men and how I could possibly capture stories and ask questions that they might not think of until these people were no longer around to be asked. So serendipity presented an opportunity via Facebook. Somebody posted something about a new grant that was being offered called Artists Engaging with Social Change. And he said there's a lot of money being given away, and it's a very unusual grant from a foundation that's never given this kind of a grant before. And the guy who posted that is someone who had been very influential in helping me get my initial funding for We Were Here. So I thought, take a look into this. So what struck me when I looked at the request for proposals, struck me right away was that the funders were open to both process-oriented work and product-oriented work. Now, to a filmmaker, you never hear that. Film grants are always product-oriented, and they're always focused on what's the end result, what's the distribution modality. You have to have that whole sense. As I've gotten older, I've been more and more not wanting to work that way or live that way. I've been much more oriented to and better at living in an organic way and allowing both serendipity and intuition to sort of guide the choices that I make in life. So the idea that this grant was open to projects that were process-oriented was extremely enticing. So I wrote what for a film grant would have been a very risky grant, which basically said, I don't know what I'm going to do with these, I don't know where the money's going to come from, I don't know what's going to happen with them, but I do know that they need to be done, and I'm the right person to do it. And I got a nice chunk of money, so that was what enabled me to start the Elders Project. And it was wonderful because there was no specific set end result. All I knew was that I was going to start doing this, and that by embracing the process-orientedness of this project, I would find out what the project would be as I went along. So it gave me an enormous amount of, well, first of all, it was very low stress. and it was very liberating to be able to work this way. So the first one I did was Jack, Steam Room Jack. And it just felt appropriate since he was the one who had kind of been the catalyst by telling me that story. And I didn't really know how I was going to do this. Jack, I asked him about interviewing him at his house, which is always my preference, and he said, my house is really a mess. And because I hadn't seen the house, I thought I don't want to take the risk of going over there and saying, yeah, it's really a mess. So we wound up shooting it at a friend's house, and it was just me and a cameraman, a straight guy, and that was it. And I was not being filmed. At that point, I was just interviewing Jack. And the interview was very interesting, and but after we did it, I guess probably just a month or two later, I started to think, I want more material. I said, for one thing, I really want Jack in his Zumba class, because I knew that he went to Zumba every week, and I thought that there's got to be some good visuals there. And so when I was going to film him again, I thought I need to find a camera person to do this. And the camera person who I chose, I thought, let me find a gay cameraman. So I picked a friend who was a guy who was not that young, but it was still a gap. He was 40 at the time, I was probably 60, and Jack was 85. So there was clearly 3 generations there. And we spent the day first filming at the Zumba class, and then I said to Jack, look, can we just go to your house and maybe do a little more interview there? And he said, well, okay. And yes, it was a mess, and which actually really contributed. It was really wonderful to sort of see him in that environment. And but he also talked about, while we were shooting, he talked about his years and years and years of going to an area out by the Golden Gate Bridge called Land's End, which was a long time cruising area for gay men. And still in his 80s, he goes out there regularly, and he says there's a whole bunch of old timers who's been seeing out there for decades. And they sit around and chit-chat, and they cruise, and sometimes they have a little action, and I mean, actually, they have quite a bit of action, which was a big surprise to my editors. But so we thought, well, let's go out to Land's End, and we'll film you out at Land's End. So we went out there, and none of this was planned. So Jack's piece is the only one that was shot in multiple locations, and where there was an interview that was done in more than one sitting. But the powerful thing about that day for me was, at the end of the day, the cameraman, I get emotional just remembering this stuff. The cameraman came up to me and he said, I would do as many of these as you want for free. He said, this was such an incredible experience to be with the two of you today, to hear Jack's stories and to be with you and to watch the two of you interacting. And I just thought, wow, that was very powerful to be told that by this younger person. He actually didn't wind up doing any more, but from that point on, well, he didn't live in San Francisco, and all the camera people were different. But at that point on, I decided, well, I want all of my editors, at least, because they'll have much more involvement in the project than the shooters. I want all of my editors to be younger generation gay men, and I want the project to be across generational collaboration, because it just then expanded into an entirely different and a much broader set of intentions than had been there originally. So again, the process and orientedness of this played out in a very constructive way for me, in that it gave me this window into doing the project differently. And also, since I had sort of come up with the idea of conversations, I thought, I should be on camera in these. I had never been on camera before, but it struck me that there would be something additional to be gained by witnessing an older and a significantly older gay man in conversation with each other, in deep conversation about historical and personal themes. So the rest of them are all shot basically in one sitting, and with both me and the subject on camera. In traveling with the film, we were here at every single Q&A. The question was asked, how did you get such incredibly rich interviews? And how did you choose the interviewees? And the reason the interviews were as rich as they were was, I think, because of the camaraderie. I obviously had lived through the same experiences as the people I was interviewing, and the two people who were on my crew, my camera woman, who's a woman named Marcia Kame, and my sound person, a woman named Loretta Molitor, also had lived through most of that period. And so all of us, there was such a sense of shared emotionality that it made it such a safe space for the people to speak. I mean, one of the people said, as they were talking, they were watching me and the two crew people crying with them as they were telling their stories. So people said, how did you pick the interviewees? And I said, well, it was kind of a combination of serendipity and intuition. All of the people were people who I kind of bumped into one way or another, who I knew a little. All of them actually I did know a little, but hadn't really thought of them necessarily as interviewees, but the subject came up in conversation, and intuition said, oh, you know, they might be really good. So I began to kind of trust that process of both serendipity and intuition. And people who I sought out because they fit into particular categories, you know, that they'd served this particular function, or they were part of this particular subset of society in relationship to the epidemic, none of those people worked. There was something much more organic in the interviewees that were chosen just through this more intuitive process. So the same thing was kind of true with the elders. Jack, obviously, the serendipity was the conversation at the gathering. There was one person who I just knew I wanted to interview. But the other ones kind of fell into my lap. And the process of deciding to do that was unconventional in the sense that I would not let them tell me anything about themselves before the camera came on. I mean, normally you want to know what the story is. But I didn't care so much what the story was because I was looking for ordinary people. What I was looking for was people who, what their eyes looked like, what their voice sounded like, did they laugh, how were they in conversation, and did I have a sense that these were the kind of people who would be willing to go on a journey of self-exploration with a camera on them. So it was really more about the chemistry than about the content of the story. So basically in doing the interviews, as you probably saw in a couple of these, I said, you know, we're just going to start at the beginning and see where this goes. And that actually was the way it went. I knew little to almost nothing about these men before the interview started. And you know, they're all like 2.5 hours, and these guys are 75 to 80 some years old. And so it required an enormous amount of both listening and also kind of strategic thinking around what is the narrative here? How do I get a narrative that goes all the way through their life before fatigue sets in, which is always a huge question in any interview with a person of any age. So there was a very kind of, and then also I'm editing in my head as I'm doing the interviews, and I'm also directing myself. I'm trying to think, what can I add here that would help either clarify something that they just said, or bring in a different subject matter that might add to the conversation, or contribute to a sense of the camaraderie that I'm hoping gets evoked by these films. So that's sort of how the process went in terms of the shooting. And for the most part, they went fine. I was planning on doing, you know, on doing this almost indefinitely because there's a huge number of stories, and also this is the kind of project that has the potential to evolve in a million different ways. I could work with young people in terms of training them how to do better interviewing, and working with older people on how to better communicate with younger people, which we're not all very good at. But I wound up only doing 6 for reasons that I can talk about later. And I shot 7, one of them just didn't work, but basically all 6 of them are, I think, actually quite rich. And you know, I think even if there were 40, I mean, no one would have watched the 40. And I think that in thinking about my objective, there's, not just with this, but with all of my work, there is an objective of imparting information, but I think the deeper agenda for me is about triggering curiosity, so that maybe people will be exposed to stories and concepts and histories that hadn't occurred to them before, and then it will either empower them to think about this stuff and maybe come up with their own questions over time that wouldn't have occurred to them to ask before. Maybe some of the younger folks would choose to sit down with the older guy at the party instead of the younger guy, realizing that there might be a once-in-a-lifetime experience in a dinner conversation. One of the things that came up a lot, I know a lot of young people, and I know a lot of very smart young people. One of the things that came up a lot was when I would say to younger guys that I was doing this, invariably it was like, thank you for doing this, it's so important. We don't have access to these stories, and it's so important that you're capturing them. Now, I don't say this, but in my mind I'm thinking, you have exactly the same access to these stories that I do. And not only do you have access to those stories, you're actually my friend, and I'm a very interesting person, and you never ask me my stories. Now, I don't say this for the same reason, because I realized that I didn't when I was that age either. So again, it's the awareness of that kind of developmental reality was a helpful, it was a helpful factor in me navigating this in a constructive way, so I didn't wind up scolding people and say, you need to be learning this, but to try to find more constructive and enticing ways to trigger curiosity. The editors were, in a sense, cast the same way as the elders were. I didn't look at their reels, I didn't look at their work. I mean, they had to have some experience editing, ideally with an interest in documentary. But I basically chose them, again, based in intuition and somewhat serendipity. Actually, my favorite story of finding an editor was, again, at one of these radical fairy gatherings. And a friend of mine was there with his boyfriend, who was 24, my friend was, 32. And the boyfriend had just come out 7 months earlier, and basically, very quickly, they had moved in together in a relatively small town. So the younger boyfriend had almost no experience with gay life, other than meeting this boyfriend on Grindr or somewhere, cohabitating in a small town, and having mostly straight friends. So here he is, terrified at a radical fairy gathering, with people running around naked and in hideous drag and putting on terrible talent shows and stuff. And so he was sort of terrorized by the whole thing. But I knew he had a background in documentary, and my friend, who was his boyfriend, said, why don't you talk to Jacob? He'd be really interested about knowing about the films that you've made. And so as I'm talking with him, I think he's really the ideal candidate to edit on something like this, because he knows almost nothing. He's an incredibly sensitive and thoughtful person, nice young Jewish boy. Just a sweet guy. We had a wonderful, 2-hour-long conversation, and I said, look, I'm doing this project. Would you be interested in editing one of them? And that was sort of how he came onto the project. It was sort of a wonderful moment that's kind of best exemplified the process. But the others came through different ways, people who I met at film festivals. But again, it was based in the sense that they would really benefit from engaging not only in the stories of these elders, but also in working with me. None of them had credits significantly as editors. They'd worked as assistant editors, or they'd edited student projects. But I mean, this was an opportunity to work with a director who had 2 pretty prominent credits as a primary editor. So what I realized is that there's in a sense, a circular mentoring process going on here. The editors are all learning sort of an incredible history from spending, 3 to 6 months listening to these older men tell their stories. They're getting mentored by me, both in filmmaking, but also in history, because I bring my own, history and stories into these situations, and I'm getting mentored by them through their perspectives, both as younger filmmakers and also as younger generation people. I mean, there was a number of times, I can't remember the specific content, in which, I would say, let's cut this bit out. And they would say, no, actually, that was really interesting. I don't know how many of you have seen the famous Hollywood movie Sunset Boulevard, but the segment at the beginning where Daniel Maloney is coming down the stairs and says, I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. Director. We just did that for fun at the end of the shoot. And, I didn't know if we'd do anything with it, but I just thought, it would be really fun to shoot this on the back stairs. It didn't occur to me to use it, and this was the young editor, the 24-year-old editor, and he's working on it. He calls me because he was in a different city, and he says, should I use that funny piece on the stairs? He said, it's really great. And I said, well, do you know what it is? And he said, no. I said, do you know what it refers to? And he said, no. And I said, have you ever heard of the movie Sunset Boulevard? And he said, no. So the fact that he thought it was funny, I thought, okay, we'll use it because it works regardless of whether you know it or not. So that was really helpful. I wouldn't have necessarily used it because I would have thought there's too many people out there who won't have any clue what this is about. So it's really helpful to get his perspective. The way that I would work with the editors is that they were all in different cities than me. I was living in Portland at the time. There was an editor in LA, there was a couple in the Bay Area. And they all completely fell in love with their elders as well. They were all really excited when they had their first opportunity to meet these guys that they were working with. There was actually an incredible moment where one of the editors, a guy named Alex, had come up from LA, and we were going to watch the piece that Alex was working on with the subject. I mean, there were reasons we had to do that I won't get into. But this was in June of 2017, I guess, which matters historically. And so we show the piece to Bob, who was the subject of the piece. And, you know, Bob had mixed feelings about aspects of it. He said, oh, I have to wind down quickly. Whew. I'll tell the story because it's good. I'll try to tell it. Anyway, Alex started talking about what his experience was working on the piece. And this moment when the three of us were together was about 2 weeks after the killings in Florida at the gay bar, the massacre at the gay bar. And Alex bursts into tears as he's talking to Bob, and he says, "It has given me so much strength in relationship to what happened in Orlando, to know that you two have both lived through so much, and that you both have become such strong and powerful people." And that was a very moving moment for Bob particularly, but also for me. Because Bob really felt, as the subject, that his participation in this had had an enormous impact on this young man. And I think that happened over and over again. So that mentoring piece was very powerful. I've actually covered a lot of this in a different order than I expected to, but I do want to say one thing, which is that just like there was a kind of a zeitgeist when I was making We Were Here, that other people were starting to work on stories that looked back at the epidemic, there also seems to be a big increase in doing work on LGBT history in a wide variety of mediums, whether it be podcasts or filmmaking or storytelling, and a lot of the work is being done by much, much younger people. And that's also really new to me, and I don't know what we'll make of this over time. Why is this happening? Why is there so much interest in younger generations in history where there hasn't been previously? And, you know, who knows? It's a mystery. These things are mysterious, but it's a wonderful development. And so I am feeling this kind of increased engagement within our community across generations around both sharing stories with each other and around making sure that our history is captured for future generations. So that's kind of like a good ending note. So should I just open it up for questions? Yes, young man in the orange, Mr. American yoga teacher.
So I'm 33. I'm young, not super young. I talk to a lot of my peers, or even the ones that are younger, and you know, they'll say things like, "Oh, I was at the bathhouse and it was all old guys," or this or that, and I say, "Well, you're gonna be that guy, so you should have some respect." I guess my question is, how do you get young people to watch what you've made? Because it sounds really fascinating and interesting, and how do I get my peers to be interested?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. You know, there's a lot of mystery there, and I think that you can say something to your friends about being at the baths and making those comments that older people can't, because there's nothing worse than finger-wagging from us older folks. So I think it's one of the things that I encourage people who are younger, who have an interest and consciousness around this kind of stuff, to find that leadership capacity within yourself, to try to open conversations that you might not have had with your friends or that they might not have had, and be a catalyst in your own realm. As to how to get people to watch the work, again, one doesn't know. And initially I was making this for posterity. I wasn't making it for public screenings, the Gay Elders piece at least. And it has become a very public project in ways that I hadn't anticipated. And in many ways, the audience coming is older, and they're really appreciating it. So I don't have any problem with that. And, you know, eventually things find their way. I don't know that there's, again, clear answers to this. But again, one of the things is you are here, there's other younger people in the room. And I think to the extent that you find that leadership capacity within yourself to have those conversations. And we as older people need to learn how to have them constructively.
I'm teaching currently Dutch students to interview Dutch gay and lesbian elders.
Wonderful.
And I noticed you said you were afraid that if somebody else did your projects, they would do it wrong. And you also said that you were tempted to teach a new generation some techniques. So could you tell either more about what you think people might do wrong, or what you would tell young people?
In terms of the wrong with the Elders Project, I don't think I had that same feeling with the Elders Project in the same way. What I really wanted with the Elders Project was for an older person to have an older person's conversation. I think that younger people doing interviews with older people is wonderful, and I've seen some wonderful ones. I think that the most important thing is to really teach people how to ask follow-up questions. And that's a life lesson that impacts every aspect of our life, and that most people are not very good at. Most people answer someone's statement by saying, well, I had that experience. And I've actually had the wonderful experience a few times in the last years of being interviewed by very young people, one 16-year-old and another guy in his late 20s who was working on his PhD. And it was like getting a really great massage because both of these guys were incredible interviewers. They listened, they asked follow-up questions. How you teach that, I don't know. But I think that the idea of going into an interview with a set of written questions is a disaster. I mean, I've been interviewed by older people who do it that way too, and I just don't think you really get quality interviews. The real skill is in the listening. And so maybe to have them work with each other on active listening, just learning active listening. And also, trying to find some balance between doing research into the history that they're investigating so that they come with some degree of context, but also doing some introspection, maybe again in a group setting, on what might their own questions be, and they might learn questions from each other.
You want to be the bridge between the elder and the younger generation, right? And I really admire that. But I, personally, as a younger generation, do you have some tips? Because for me, I feel like if I want to talk to like the older generation, I want to listen to their story, but I don't really know where to start.
Well, you're starting just at the right place, which is curiosity, which many people don't have. So I just want to acknowledge that your curiosity is the first and most important step. Every culture also has its own kind of boundaries around what's appropriate, kinds of conversations to have. I mean, I remember even when I moved to Holland, the ways people related to each other on first meeting was very different than I was accustomed to from the West Coast. But I think always, I don't think there's anyone who is offended by someone being interested in hearing their story. People have the capacity to say no and to set their boundaries. But I think most people, if you say to them, I'm sure you've had an interesting life, and there's things that you've probably lived through that I can't even imagine. How would you feel comfortable with me sitting down with you and asking and having you tell me some stories? I mean, I think it's really the only way to start. It's taking a risk on your part, and someone may say no, but most people, I think, are delighted to have a younger person say, I really would love to hear your stories. One of the things that I didn't get a chance to address in the talk was the specific problem around cross-generational stuff with gay men, which is that there's a tremendous amount of sexual discomfort cross-generationally. And I think that that's something that is very specific to our community, that is a huge problem, a completely understandable problem, but I think it's one that we really all need to put an enormous amount of internal work into figuring out how do we cross those barriers.
Can you be more specific on that?
Well, I think younger men are often afraid that older men are going to hit on them. I think older men are often afraid that they're going to be perceived as lechers. I think older men can often be afraid of their own desires and not even want to be around younger men. I think younger men also may be afraid of their own desires and not want to be around older men. I mean, there's a million reasons, but I think there is this perception that older guys are going to hit on younger guys, that older men sometimes don't want to conform to, and that keeps people apart. And they're absolutely real and understandable issues. But we have to figure out ways of dealing with that, and I think those are conversations that have to be had in a conscious and intentional way.
If you've seen the recent series of Tales of the City, there's quite a powerful scene at the dinner table where the elders say what would be now perceived quite a offensive comment around trans people, and then the younger person kind of kicks off and there's this kind of big fight over it. So I don't know if you had looked at the other way around of what the youngers can teach elders, or whether that's kind of...
Well, my sense of that scene, I don't know how many people have seen that scene is the perception that I've heard from people of multiple generations is that the kind of scolding that the older guys gave to the younger guy was on some level appropriate. But yes, of course, the conversation has to go both ways. There has to be a mutual interest and a mutual respect. But there are different things that can come from the different sides. It's not a parallel situation. The life experience and history experience generally tends to come more from one side of the equation, and the connectedness to contemporary issues tends to come more from the younger side of the equation. Howie.
Thank you. Great to see you. Really great to see you. First of all, as a Dutch audience, and I know some of the words we use, like serendipity, and as some words don't translate into Dutch words and are really hard to explain what they mean, like my friend here also, and you use it often as some of your guiding way in your life, how you create things through a serendipity of accident.
It's not easy to explain in English either, but if it's helpful, I would say that serendipity is a mixture of luck and chance and magic, and that's about as far as I would go.
There's no word in Dutch.
Yeah, but it's not fate. It's not fate. There's nothing predetermined. And I do believe that serendipity can be cultivated, which is somewhat paradoxical. But
as a gay elder, I want to be more than just someone who sits in an armchair and tells stories about how nice it was, or great it was, or exciting it was, and want to be equal to a youthful person, and don't want to be labeled necessarily with this loaded definition of gay elder.
Well, here, it's like...
It's a bit of age, it's a kind of...
Well, it depends on how you carry it. I mean, it really depends on how you carry yourself and how you utilize that position. And I do think that you know, if you ask people, do you fuck more for your pleasure or do you fuck more for your partner's pleasure? And you get very different answers. But I think in the telling of stories, I think it's a really important question to ask ourselves. Am I telling this story because I get pleasure out of telling my stories, or am I telling my stories because I think that there's specific value in this moment to this particular situation? And I think the intentionality of telling stories for a reason is crucial to good eldering.
Yeah, but I'm talking about, I feel as younger as I was before as I do as old as I am.
That's all right. But you're older than me.
And younger than you.
Okay.
I would like to ask you if you have screened your film to non-queer audience, and what the reaction was.
All of them, or just the elders?
Please, because there is a logic. This is what I want to explain. So there's no doubt that in gay community there is ageism, there is racism, there are other forms of discrimination. But at the same time, interracial relations, intergenerational relations, and also relations across social classes are much more common than among straights. So I wonder, like, what kind of message your movie can give to non-queer people, or if you have thought about that.
Are you talking specifically about the Elders Project or all of the films?
Well, I have not watched any of these two movies, but I mean about the communication between younger and older generations.
You know, with We Were Here, I made it specifically for gay people, and on some level for this project, I made it specifically for young gay men of now and the future. And beyond that, everything was sort of secondary in intention. But the wonderful thing about that is when people who are completely outside of your target group see it, and you get wonderful and completely unexpected reactions. I actually had a screening of this Elders Project at which a woman stood up. It was the piece where the man had been married for 18 years, and she stood up and she said, you know, there are a lot of us, women, who were married to men who came out and left us. She said, it would be wonderful to be able to watch this with a whole group of women who have had that experience, because there's no group for us. There's no, as far as she knew, there was no kind of thing of women whose husbands came out and left them. And so she said it would be fantastic to sit and watch this with a group of women who had that shared experience. So you never know. And a woman in the UK who was in her 80s watched We Were Here, and she said, you know, I didn't know hardly anything about the epidemic. I've never really known gay people. I lived in the country, so I don't feel guilty about knowing all of that. But your movie made me realize that I could be a better friend than I've been to my friend, to the people in my life. And this really made me think about what kind of a friend I am. So you just never really know what kind of reactions people outside of a target audience are going to have. Thank you very much, David.